Good afternoon, and thank you so much for the kind invitation to share my work with you today. I'm impressed that so many people made it out on this gorgeous day post-vacation, but very appreciative in your interest in the project. My presentation today will take two parts. The first will be a description of my dissertation, book project, which is on the afterlife of the Turkish poet Nazim Hikmet. And I'll give particular attention to the Turkish-German context to sort of cue up the second half, which is a summary of a chapter that's currently under revision, which analyzes the German language book of poetry entitled Nazim Hikmet, auf dem Schiff zu Mars, on the ship to Mars, a work that reevaluates Hikmet's reception in post-Cold War Germany. I've brought the poetry book. It's not very renowned outside of the subfield of Turkish-German studies, but it is quite interesting as a book object, as well as the contents, which I'll go over, but I thought I'd pass it around in case you want to poke around in it. So the year is 1977, and Turkey's foremost modernist poet, Nazim Hikmet, is turning 75. Never mind that the beloved and contested poet has been deceased for more than a decade. The Turkish papers announce Şair Baba 75 yaşında. Let's see, how do I? The father poet is 75 years old, and Nazim aramızda. Nazim is among us. Born in Ottoman Thessaloniki in 1902, Hikmet was an avowed communist and sometime member of the Turkish Communist Party. Hikmet was tried and convicted on charges of sedition when his literary works were found in the dormitory of a Navy cadet in 1938. His subsequent torture by the Turkish state and conviction are sometimes compared to the French Dreyfus affair, insofar as they represented a gross miscarriage of justice and reflected a very divided population. He was subsequently imprisoned until 1950 before being released as part of a general amnesty and fleeing to the Soviet Union, where he died in exile in 1963. Called a Vatan Haini, a national traitor by his detractors, and Şair Baba, father poet, by his supporters, Hikmet is an enduring point of conflict in an ever-changing political landscape. Banned from publishing in Turkey for the majority of his adult life, Hikmet became one of the country's most widely read and celebrated poets in the decades following his death. Returning to the occasion of his would-be 75th birthday, celebrations of Hikmet's life are planned and banned accordingly. In Istanbul, following a celebration of Hikmet's birthday hosted by the Turkish Writers' Union, the union announces a campaign to return Hikmet's remains to his native Turkey, a campaign that is still active today. And the Turkish government, in turn, opens up a legal case against the union. Countless other celebrations are prevented or shut down by police, and a group of 6 school teachers in attendance at one celebration are publicly reprimanded and fired from their jobs. Another legal case is opened up against the mayor of Ankara, who brought a handful of Anatolian soil to the poet's Moscow grave on an official state visit. Turkish newspapers run editorials touting headlines with a quip from the cultural minister. To honor Hikmet is not leftism, it's cowardliness. Meanwhile, in West Germany, where hundreds of thousands of Turkish citizens have recently immigrated as part of a post-war guest work program, the mood is quite different. During a week-long celebration organized by the Turkish Academic and Artist Society, 10,000 revelers attend 9 events, making it the largest event organized by non-citizens in the history of West Germany. Turkish author and famed trade unionist Fakir Baykurt co-organizes an art exhibition in Hikmet's honor. Turkish actress Semra Özdemir and poet Atal Beranoğlu performed public recitations of Hikmet's poetry. Hikmet's German translators organize a symposium on Hikmet's life and work. In his first international concert, the famed Turkish composer Ruhi Su sings Hikmet's songs in Turkish, while the Hans Eisler Chor does the same in German translation. Playwright Genco Erkal's Vi Kerem, like Kerem, a piece named for and based on Hikmet's poetry, is staged as a bilingual performance piece at the Einman Theater. West German President Walter Scheel and Chancellor Helmut Schmidt send their official well wishes to the revelers in Kreuzberg. In Turkish communities in Germany, currently estimated at around 3 million people, echoes of Nazim Hikmet have appeared for decades in so-called Turkish-German literature, as well as in the publications of countless social movements, ranging from anti-racist, pro-multiculturalist movement of the late 1980s to the anti-Pegida protests of 2014 and 15. For the generations of Turks who immigrated from Turkey to West Germany as guest workers in the 60s and 70s, the distance from Turkish censors meant unprecedented freedom to write and read about their Turkish political left and its controversial poet. From the 60s onward, translations of Hikmet's poetry appeared regularly both in East and West Germany, and Hikmet was regularly quoted to give political and social legibility to acts of violence and injustice, particularly those perpetrated by far-right and ultranationalist groups, both Turkish and German. While scholars have long commented on Hikmet's profound influence within Turkish-German communities, no study has yet undertaken to see what effect Turkish-German literature, culture, and politics have had in shaping Hikmet's remarkable afterlife. The book project at hand, entitled A Shared Longing, Rewriting Nazim Hikmet in Turkish and Turkish-German Literature, examines the posthumous construction of deeply political, interpretive communities around the poetry and persona of Nazim Hikmet. Today, both Hikmet's poetry and biography continue to be important touchstones in the way Turkish and Turkish-German identities are imagined in literature as well as public life. Situating the works of Oğuz Altay, Emine Sevgi Özdemir, Saliha Şahinhart, Berkan Karpat, Zafer Şenocak, and Nedim Gürsel within a broader constellation of literary and non-literary texts that reference Hikmet's poetry, A Shared Longing proposes a re-examination of the way communities are imagined in and through shared texts. The project's title refers to a line from Hikmet's poetry, Davet, invitation, which has become a rallying cry for the Turkish left, particularly during and after the Gezi Park protests of 2013. In Invitation, Hikmet declares the existence of a community whose original organizing principle, a country, memleketimiz, is replaced by another, a shared longing, hazretimiz. In his afterlife, the allusions to Hikmet that proliferate in literature and public life are freighted with such political, social, and communal desires. So I have here just the first and last stanzas of Davet, but you can see how the last line of the first stanza, this country is ours, is then replaced in the final stanza by this longing is ours. So by describing and analyzing the ways in which Turkish and Turkish-German writers ventriloquize, echo, and rewrite Hikmet's works, we see how the poet's biography and poetry alike become potent signifiers within social and political contexts, spanning from the 1970s post-coup Turkey to reunified Germany. So studies that examine authorial legacy and commemoration tend to focus on themes of widespread and sustained influence, intellectual or cultural inheritance, and above all, the unique genius of the figure in question. Such themes operate within a paradigm in which relationships among texts are limited to a one-way contribution of original ideas and creative works, whereby the younger generations receive and benefit from the inheritance of an intellectual or artistic legacy. Meanwhile, studies of relationships among texts not focused on legacy permit much more diversity in the nature of these textual relationships, reflecting Julia Kristeva's insight that intertextuality is not limited to literary allusion, but is rather a much more generalizable phenomenon common among all texts as inherently dialogical or simply social phenomena. A glance at the recent studies of intertextuality reveals a rich diversity of relationships that can be enacted through reference. Among them, repetition, seen as reprising, repeating, restating, haunting, understood as inhabitation, embodiment, dwelling, and subversion, with themes like parody, speaking back, undermining, and appropriating. In many cases, texts also enter into complex dialogues that are not reducible to any single intertextual relationship. In the context of Hikmet's legacy in the Turkish and German literary and cultural history, many relationships among texts go unnoticed because of the tendency to focus on metaphors of patrilineal inheritance. Departing from studies of authorial afterlife that are based on this narrow principle of influence, I maintain that Nazim Hikmet instead is a shared intertext, an absence that is marked both in literary and political discourse, which is recreated and redefined throughout the second half of the 20th century. So the chapter that I'll present on today focuses on an example from Turkish-German literature, where Hikmet is seen as one scholar puts it, the most powerful source of inspiration for German writers of Turkish heritage, despite the fact that Hikmet never lived in and only infrequently visited Germany. Citing this outsized influence, some scholars have referred to Hikmet as the grandfather of Turkish-German literature. From novelists Güney Dal, Salia Scheinhardt, and Emin Sevgi Özdemir to poets like Aras Ören, Zafer Şenocak, and Yüksel Pazarkaya, every major writer of Turkish-German literature has been linked to Hikmet in critical literature. Many authors have also drawn these linkages themselves, or alluded to Hikmet's work in their own. The specific grounds for comparison are varied. While some scholars attend to specific intertexts, links between Hikmet's committed communist poetry and leftist Turkish-German authors, others describe a more general sense of influence stemming from a shared experience of exile. Notably, these exilic experiences of Hikmet and Turkish labor migrants in West Germany arise from very different historical and social conditions. Nevertheless, Hikmet's self-fashioned exilic poetry, which thematizes the experience of longing for memleketim, my country, and bears the toponymy of his travels across the Soviet Union and Europe in evocative postscripts, took on an important symbolic role for Turkish-German authors and their readers. The metaphor of patrilineal inheritance has clear ties to a reductive concept of diaspora connected spiritually to a fatherland with an attendant body of literature that deals solely with its loss. The filial metaphor of cultural inheritance is seemingly reinforced by Turkish-German visual artist, poet, and cultural critic Berkan Karpat, who calls himself Nazim's bayerische Enkel, so Nazim's Bavarian grandchild. Born in Istanbul and raised in Munich, Karpat rose to prominence in the performance art scene in 1998 with an exhibition entitled Nazim Hikmet auf dem Schiff to Mars, on the ship to Mars. The latter part of this title alludes to an untitled poem by Hikmet in which the speaker imagines his words being read in some distant future by passengers on a spacecraft bound for the Red Planet. In 3 installations, Karpat created echo chamber experiences using newly released voice recordings of Hikmet reading his own poetry. These recordings, taken during Hikmet's travels throughout Soviet countries, were held in Soviet archives until the end of the Cold War, such that Karpat's exhibition staged the return of Hikmet's voice to reunified Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall. In a second iteration of the piece, so this is one of the CDs that's available of these recordings. In the second iteration of the piece, On the Ship to Mars 2, Karpat attempted the first transatlantic sleep experiment using the same recordings of Hikmet's voice to synchronize the REM cycles of 2 groups of sleepers, one at the Deutsches Museum in Munich and the other in Cambridge, Massachusetts. There's much to say about both of these, but our focus today will be on a book of poetry that's a companion piece to the first exhibit. Karpat also, that he co-authored with Zafer Şenocak, which is entitled Auf dem Schiff to Mars as well. In foregrounding Hikmet's poetry and biography in his own work, Karpat seems to link his larger artistic and political project to Hikmet's. And his playful moniker that he gives himself as the Bavarian grandchild of Nazim seems to nod to a sense of enduring filial piety to the exiled father poet in the German migration context. However, a closer examination of Karpat and Şenojak's book of poetry reveals a deep-seated ambivalence towards normative conceptions of inheritance or influence vis-a-vis Hikmet's legacy. The authors, rather than creating original content, self-consciously recycle phrases and images from Hikmet's poetry. The reader, rather than simply attempting to understand what the text means, must also grapple with how the text means, i.e. through the indirect channel of literary allusion, movement between texts. The text itself becomes shared property, neither wholly belonging to Karpa and Shenojek, nor yet to Hikmet. These tactics of rewriting call into question the understanding of the author as a paternal figure, that is, the unique, unassisted creator of a complete, whole, original textual product. Going beyond the binary narratives of fatherhood in which one either reveres the father or wrestles him into submission, On the Ship to Mars inaugurates a new relationship with Hikmet, one defined not by filial piety, but by the lover's hasret, or longing for the absent beloved. Staged as an audio play, On the Ship to Mars begins with a list of 5 voices, like the first page of a playbill. A speaker, 15 children, a dervish angel, a sound engineer, and a tape player. However, these names quickly fall away. The poem that follows does not introduce any of these characters, nor does it delineate which voice is speaking when. Such that the matter of who is speaking remains unsettled throughout the 12 segments of the poem. The speaker or speakers' primary focus is always Hikmet. Sometimes Nazim is the speaker. Other times the speaker discusses Nazim in the third person. The poem is filled with the most famous phrases of Hikmet's poetry, adopting a conspicuously intertextual or even collaborative mode of composition, splicing, mixing, and repeating lines of Hikmet's best-known poetry, translated into German. Hikmet's poems appear in approximate order of publication. Take the first segment, for example. Tonight I drink the sun. Tonight on this ship, the sun from the veins of the machine, the literary machine, the machine room from the machine room of the torturers, of the literary machine Nazim. Drink the voice of the sun from the veins of the tape recorder. Drink Shamsidin. 2 by 2 dark space spins in my veins, the veins of the tape recorder, the machine Nazim dreams. The first line alludes to Hikmet's rousing Güneşi içen türküsü, Song for the Sun Drinkers. Sun Drinkers was the first poem in his first book of poetry published in 1928, 835 satır, 835 lines, which was the first collection of Turkish language modernist verse. The next several lines, which refer variously to machines, allude to Hikmet's foray into Russian futurism during his 1922 enrollment in Soviet Communist University of the Toilers for the East. And more precisely to another one of his works, Makinelaşmak istiyorum, I Want to Become a Machine, also published in 835 lines. The 9th line, Drink Shamsidin, is a reference to an enigmatic dervish and a teacher and friend of Rumi, the great mystic poet, and thus also reference to Hikmet's early works, early education in a Sufist tradition under his maternal grandfather's tutelage, as well as to Hikmet's vast array of poetry that deals in mystical metaphors. Most famous among them, Mevlana, a nickname given to Rumi. So this interweaving of Hikmet's early poetry renders uncanny images that blend the futuristic and the mystical, the mechanized man and the sun drinker, the terror and intoxication of a speaker in a 2 by 2 dark space, a phrase that refers to the infamous episode in Hikmet's biography when in 1938 he was tortured for days aboard a Navy vessel before being convicted. Jumping ahead to the penultimate verse, segment 11, the poem refers to two other poems Hikmet wrote much later in the 1960s while in exile. The first is Seviyorum seni, ekmeğe tuzu bana diğer gibi, which means it's an untitled poem, but the first line that's known by is I love you like dipping bread into salt and eating. And the other poem that is dominant in this verse is Nereye giden Kosmos gemisi, Tourist on the Ship to Mars, the titular poem. For playing with the red apple between the stars, for playing with between the stars, a giant red apple, a warm loaf, for one day at least, for a ship full of children in salt, children turned into salt, as one breaks sun and dips it in salt, between the stars, a ship full of children in salt, children turned into salt on the ship to Mars. The verse mixes imagery from the two poems, pairing the image of the red planet spinning among the stars like a fruit with the warm bread dipped in salt in Hikmet's poem about his wife Vera. and briefly harkens back to a third poem, The Sun Drinkers, with the line, "As one drinks sun." As a play, On the Ship to Mars plotline revolves around a singular action, the playing of Hikmet's voice on a cassette player. The speaker first describes the act of playing the tape as a way of freeing Hikmet's voice from the Soviet archives, as well as from narrowly political interpretations of his poetry during the Cold War era, as in the line, "I give birth to your voice frozen in iron crystals, encircled in a Stalin corset." However, it becomes clear throughout the poem, as mismatched lines are paired and interspersed, that the tape player is simultaneously destroying the recording. The last segment, the 12th segment, announces that most of Nazim has gone away, only little remained, and attributes this loss to the process of zermalen, milling down the tones of his voice by the audio player. It is clear that the poem itself is involved in the process of fragmenting and dismembering, playing Hikmet's voice through the destructive tape player, collecting the pieces that remain from earlier destruction, and proceeding to mill it down until little or nothing is left. Thus, while On the Ship to Mars is clearly derivative and constantly foregrounds its own intertextuality, the relationship established in Hikmet's poetry is not one of ancestral veneration, nor of generational deference. Instead, through the incessant repetition of Hikmet's most time-worn phrases, Hikmet's voice becomes at once mechanized and ritualized. The mystic motif is central to each of the poem's 12 segments, whose repetitive nature immediately recalls zikr, the devotional acts in Islam in which short phrases or prayers are repeatedly recited. The poetic speaker variously drinks, gives birth to, and burns and destroys the other voices. He also divides himself such that the I is both separate from and conjoined to Nazim. He takes on many roles and many titles, including a postman, a simple Turkish poet, a sound engineer, but most frequently he is a dervish. This constellation of images, including metaphors of turning, drinking, intoxication, and themes of burning, longing, and ingestion, suggests a primary relationship to Hikmet's voice through mystic figuration. The theme of the voice itself invites the reader to recall the central importance of the ney, or reed flute, in the Sufi tradition. In the opening lines of Rumi's spiritual couplets entitled Masnevi Manevi, the ney is introduced and praised for its solemn lament. Hearken to the reed flute, how it complains, lamenting its banishment from its home. The plate of the flute is fire, not pure air. Let him who lacks fire be dead. 'Tis the fire of love that inspires the flute. 'Tis the ferment of love that inspires the wine. The sound of the ney represents man's longing for the divine. The breath entering the reed makes manifest the soul's animation of the body. The Masnevi exalts the ney as the perfect man and the ideal believer, whose passion for the divine beloved causes him to, quote, weep like one whose soul is cut off from the original homeland. This same affect, longing, hasret, animates Hikmet's poetry, both for his country and for his lovers, and is associated with his legacy. Perhaps the most common figurative displacement for the believer's relationship to the divine is that of the crazed lover, called Mejnun in Turkish, who goes mad following the caravan of the beloved Layla through the desert. Mystical poetry centers around the mysterious nature of the divine as beloved, and the intoxicating effect that this overpowering love has on the believer. In On the Ship to Mars, these metaphors accrue to the figure of Hikmet. At times, the named voice, Nazim, displays the telltale signs of mystic love, drinking, ingesting, burning, and turning, and at other times, the unnamed voice experiences such love in relationship to Nazim. Thus inaugurates a new relationship to Hikmet, one defined not by filial piety, but by the lover's hasret, or longing. This creative romantic use of repetition recalls Derrida's reinterpretation of the mythic figure of Echo. Echo, who is punished by the gods for her flirtatious chatter, not with muteness, but with the inability to produce original speech, is traditionally seen as a symbol of female weakness or subservience. When the nymph falls in love with beautiful Narcissus, she cannot speak to him except by repeating his own words back to him. The episode is rendered in one English translation as follows. Lost in the woods one day, Narcissus hears Echo's movement and calls to her, "Is anyone here?" "And here," cried Echo back. Amazed, she looks round in all directions with the loud voice cries, "Come," and come she calls him, calling. Rather than repeating Narcissus' full sentence, Echo strategically selects the words she chooses to repeat and alters the intonation such that she both references his speech and creates her own meaning out of his words. Noting this strategy, Derrida points out that the nymph uses her punishment from the gods to both draw her beloved closer and to confess her love. Quote, "She overflows with love. Her love overflows the calls of Narcissus, whose fall or whose sending she simply seems to produce. A dissymmetrical, unequal correspondence, unequal, as always, to the equality of the one to the other. Come, says Narcissus. Come, answers Echo, of herself and on her own," end quote. Derrida's rereading of Echo allows us to see Karpat and Shenojak's elusive poem as a way of drawing Hikmet into conversation, not as a child invoking a father figure, but rather with a lover's intimacy. On the Ship to Mars does not imitate Hikmet's poetry, but rather echoes it back in a new language, creating fresh meanings through context and inflection. Scholar Yasemin Yildiz suggests that the novelist Eline Sevgi Özdemir's frequent literal translation of Turkish phrases into German are a form of traumatic recall. Through the multilingual mode of writing, Özdemir's narrator Sevgi finds a linguistic space in which to heal from the political and social violence in the Turkish Republic that still permeates her experience of her mother tongue. In On the Ship to Mars, the speaker similarly suggests that the repetition of Hikmet's most famous lines in the German language poem is first and foremost an act of freeing Hikmet from the Stalin corset, that is, from the politicized usages of his poetry that had worn down his voice since the recording was made. It's interesting to note that by the late 1990s, when On the Ship to Mars was published, Turkey's nationalist leaders on the far right began to downplay Hikmet's communist legacy and revolutionary politics, claiming him instead as a nationalist poet. As pointed out by Nargis, such nationalist uses erroneously recast Hikmet's embrace of vernacularization, the use of everyday speech as a literary language, in the 1930s and 40s as an acceptance of Turkish nationalism phonocentrism. Yet while the German language poem certainly operates as a site of traumatic recall of violence perpetrated by the Turkish state, especially of Hikmet's torture aboard the Navy ship, On the Ship to Mars also admits a desire for Hikmet's poems to break free of the heavily freighted history of reception in Turkish contexts, seeing translation as a way for his voice to take on new lives in a new language. Indeed, even the most hackneyed phrases from his ardent political verses take on new, yet unheard sounds in a new language. Phrases like, "Bruder, du bist kein Baum im Wald," brother, you are no tree in the wood, and "Wie Kerem sollst du brennen," like Kerem, you should burn. Phrases that carry so much weight in Turkish are strange and novel in German. The German language speakers imagine their poem as a co-creation with Hikmet through sexualized metaphors befitting the relationship between lovers. Quote, "Separated from my beloved, I drink from the glass cup. From the sea of iron sperm, I give birth to your voice." Hikmet's Turkish, which is both present and not present in the translated verses, thus becomes the creative seed that animates the Turkish-German poets, rather than the authority figure that asserts his influence in the migration context. This way of interpreting Hikmet's text is concordant with the mode of reading suggested by the verse from which Karpat and Shenojak draw their title. Tourists on the Ship to Mars will read poems written on Earth, opening every word, tone by tone, color by color, layer by layer. They will be able to reach the most secretive seed. The space journey is a potent metaphor for reading Hikmet in a Turkish-German context. Since Hikmet's words were banned in Turkey until 1965 and remained only semi-legal for years thereafter, the early Turkish Gastarbeiter were perhaps the first legal readers of Hikmet's poetry since his 1938 conviction. Hikmet's untitled poem also suggests a decompositional reading practice that reflects the mode of writing we see in On the Ship to Mars. In Hikmet's poem, The speaker first states generally that the poems will be read, and then devotes the second half of the brief poem to describing the specific reading practice itself in both precise and suggestive terms. The act of reading is explicitly intrusive and even destructive to the poem by opening, açarak, every word beste beste, tone by tone, renk renk, color by color, and kat kat, layer by layer. They will be able to reach the most sırlı seed. The adjective sırlı, which can either mean secretive or glazed, hardened, suggests that the texts contain elements that are difficult to reach because they are closed off or mysterious. Thus, Karpat and Şenocak's chosen title posits a specific form of decompositional labor on their part, a breaking down of barriers between reader and author, origin and derivation, text and text, in order to release the fecund seed of Hikmet's poetry in a new language and a new post-Cold War world order. Thank you. And I meant to, at the beginning of my talk, say a huge thank you to Marius for the kind invitation. But yeah, I'd be very happy to take your questions.
I'd just be interested in hearing you talk a little bit more about the reasons behind why voice and orality seem to be so important to what you're doing here. I mean, you mentioned a number of different things, the trope of drinking the voice of the sun, the practice of zikr, the photocentrism argument and things like that. And even in this last poem, the idea of, I'm not sure if tone by tone is color, so something is seen, or if it's tonal sound or something like that. But sound seems to be particularly important to what you're doing, and the idea of kind of reanimating or returning his voice to what's legally hearable seems to be important. But I'm not sure why it's important that it's the voice itself as opposed to just the words that's mediated on a page or something.
Great question. So there is a whole section on the voice that I completely excised from the presentation. But if I recall it, my thought is, well, one is that the voice is very important to the way Hikmet's poetry was passed around initially. So Orhan Pamuk says that cassette tapes of Hikmet were passed around in his childhood like secret treasures. That they went from sort of household to household, and because they were on and off band. So the voice was the way that a lot of his poems were heard, and many of them have since been set to music. So I think voice is really central to, those dynamics of censorship, who can experience it, who cannot. But then also, another thing is Hikmet's voice itself was quite famous. That he wasn't just sort of a lyricist on the page. When he went to the Soviet Union in the early 20s, he was really taken by the style of, pronouncing. He loved Meyerhold and Mayakovsky. Like, he was very into that whole world, and he was the way he ended up coming back and reading his poetry in Turkish was very striking. And people will do, like, if I tell someone that I study Nazim, then they'll do an impression sometimes of this style of poetic enunciation. But I think for Karpat, with these, what I didn't go into is that his works of visual art are really also like audioscapes, where he takes these CDs or these cassette tapes at the time, and sort of, he himself was an audio technician before he became an artist. And he sort of scraped them down, and I have the cassette, which I almost brought, but it literally is just like kind of faint sounds in the distance, you can hardly hear him. But he was really interested, I think, in this idea of that the voice affects you in a different way than reading the poem on the page. And he played up he diversified the ways in which you could be affected by a voice by making the voice sometimes put people to sleep. But other times, people's movements actually cause Hikmet's voice to be played. So that, there's this very intimate connection to the poet, basically created through the voice, which is bodily. So I think that's Karpat's primary interest, that it is a form of intimacy. Again, it's this idea that rather than sort of receiving it, he's deconstructing it, but not for the purpose of violence, to become sort of closer to it, become closer to Hikmet. He feels you can't do that while maintaining the distance of the text.
Yeah, you've been talking about presence. As I look at the last two lines of the poem, that seems to me a very classical kind of allegory. This is what you do in allegorical reading, right? And I suppose the first half of this part says that you can read allegorically only from a distance, only from a kind of alienation. So I wonder if you could sort of bring those two parts together, both the presence of the voice that's preserved and slowly being lost, with the sense that, well, actually, we aren't going to find out what it's saying, until it is far, far away.
That you're saying that with the intimacy, you lose something. But
no, I think that the point I'm making is pretty simple, right? That when we try to reach the most simple seed, right? That is, we read under integument, right, down to the core, the nut, whatever customs you use, right? We're reading allegorically.
Yeah, let's see, think about allegory in the context of that.
Exilic writers are always allegorical writers. Right? And the great allegorical writers of the 20th century are writers who are under state pressure.
Right. Yeah. That everything is always filled with hidden meanings because that's the only way that meaning can be conveyed. Yeah. Yeah, and certainly, I would say Hikmet's an interesting case in that because he trafficked in mystical metaphors that would have been pretty well known, like his famous poem, Kerem Gibi Like Kerem. It's about, this person who's sort of catching on fire with his passion in the narrative, in the original, for the beloved, but for him it's for a new future, a new world, a new democracy. And so Hikmet's allegories were always not the most secretive seeds, So it's interesting that in his afterlife, maybe, the idea of the voice and the sort of destruction of the voice moves away from allegories that have become sort of hackneyed or overplayed, and thus lose a sense of connection. So I think, that this sort of breaking down, in this case, rather than the discovery of the hidden meaning, is a sort of release of bringing the poetic, the romantic Hikmet out from under the sort of weight of the allegory of the censored writer. Yeah. Yeah, so it's good. Yes.
So I know that you put a lot of emphasis on this textual community that is created around this figure that is really canonical and important, right? But I was wondering if you can say something about the connection between this textual community and other forms of community, other social communities, whether political or exilic or migrant. The reason that I wanted to hear more about this is that I feel that one part that is slightly de-emphasized is the publicness of these citations as well as usages, appropriations of Hikmet, who was a very public figure, right? So I feel like that whereas when we critique this canonical diasporic paradigm as patrilineal, when we emphasize this intimacy, it seems like then it sort of becomes more individualistic and private, especially with your emphasis on intimacy, but I don't think that's intended, so I wanted to hear more about the publicness.
I think that, so some of the ways that Hikmet is used in public space, in Turkish-German public space, are like, there's a massive monument in Katlasator in Kreuzberg that has, Allah they are the enemies of hope, my love. Like, it's a quote from Hikmet that's just there in the center, unattributed, but the sort of passerby who spoke Turkish would likely know that phrase and be able to attribute it to him. So it's like, in that case, the person who would recognize it would be like the person who speaks Turkish, right? So it's sort of, I guess, references a community in that way, and the person in recognizing it also sees themselves as a member of a community that understands that reference. But I think that some usages like that, where Hikmet is sort of, he's used to both create a community, but then he's also brought in as a sort of like external moral authority, who's sort of condemning a racist or xenophobic or Islamophobic act in the West German context. There's a way in which I think he's read privately and at home in a very different way than he'd be read in the public or political sphere. And so my reading of this book of poetry is a sort of trying to reclaim that relationship that many feel is much more intimate, perhaps individualistic, even while being part of a communal experience of his texts, than the celebrated Hikmet, who is the public, the basic monuments in Turkey and in Germany, the sort of go-to poet for whenever there's an act of violence, basically, that's xenophobic. So in other words, I think that just because it's intimate doesn't mean it's less communal. It's just a different relationship with the poet than the one that is most knowable from a sort of outside point of view, if that makes sense. That's how I see the poem. Yeah?
So Hikmet has a double legacy in Germany. On the one hand, there is the Turkish Gastarbeiter writing that were working him through since the 1960s. On the other hand, as one of these major writers in the literary firmament of the socialist world, he had a court function in all these socialist countries. He was translated into all these languages. Chinese, this is 1953, this is where I first encountered him. He was also translated into German, published in the German Democratic Republic in the 50s. So there's an alternative legacy there. Have these two strands of legacies of reading being reconciled with the consciousness of these two strands? Was there an interaction there? I'm very curious, do you know?
I think this was sort of the beginning of it. There are, one of the novels that I look at in the dissertation is exactly about that, like how to reconcile who these poets call the Stalin Hikmet, with like the beloved Hikmet. And I think, he's not necessarily to be reconciled. Like the sort of proliferation of Hikmets is the thing that was new at this moment, that he wasn't solely going to be seen as like the communist writer or the Stalin Hikmet that basically there was a sort of coming to terms in the 90s with what it meant that in Hikmet's poetry, he dreamed of a communist future, right? And so that image was just there and was up for literal interpretation. And all of a sudden it wasn't, with the sort of collapse of the Soviet regime. What do you do with that whole narrative within his poetry? So I think that poems like this are exactly that type of how do we reconcile. I mean, their solution is to sort of try to free him from it, but clearly it's a very violent act that doesn't settle things. It just sort of gives a proliferation of Nazims that sort of you end with. But I think, there's a tension that's constant, particularly in the West German context, because he was published earlier in East Germany and read there in a much different way than by the Turkish workers who came over from the Turkish Republic in the 60s and 70s.
I had two questions, actually. The first was about the role Hasret plays is for German Turkish writers like Hikmet, but also perhaps more recent writers who are no longer in an exilic context, does the political register then become more important for them in your view? And the second thing was the role of Oğuz Atay in this constellation of mostly German Turkish writers, if you could speak to that too.
Yeah, the Oğuz Atay, basically the dissertation or the book project is actually a comparative study of Hikmet's afterlife in the Turkish-German context and then in the Turkish one. And I particularly looked at usages of Hikmet in sort of a post-coup context. The Oğuz Atay chapter looks at Hikmet in a series of death notices. So his poetry was used they would just use a quotation from his work for young leftist martyrs in the 70s. And Oğuz Atay, Oğuz Atay uses him in a very similar way, I argue, as a sort of speaker for death. He comes in, instead of the state's narration, as it would be on a gravestone or in a standard death notice, Hikmet's character comes in to tutuklamayanlar in a similar way. So it's not related to the Turkish-German context. And then your first question was about whether Hasret sort of became less sort of politicized, if I understand it correctly?
More politicized.
Oh, more politicized. Yeah, I think, the title of the dissertation, this idea of a shared longing that replaces the national organization becomes a new sort of organizing principle. I think it has some similar valences with like a democracy to come, like the community to come. It's sort of never realizable. And I think it's very flexible. And that's one of the reasons why his poetry and his afterlife have been so well used in, not for political and sort of social aims, is because he's always calling out for something that's in the future. The dissertation begins and ends with looking at how his remains are treated in the Turkish press in particular. So Hikmet has this poem where he asks to be buried in an unmarked grave in Anatolia. And he wrote this, of course, in exile. And so there's been this campaign since his 75th birthday to bring his remains back and like carry out his wishes. And so his absence from the Turkish Republic is often used to stand in for, it's like an incomplete community, and democracy will not come to Turkey until his remains have been sort of brought back home. So yeah, I think that there's a continuing. I'm very curious to see what would happen, if anything, if and when his remains were like brought back to Turkey, because I think that symbol is so powerful, particularly like the Gezi Park movement was. There were calls to bring Hikmet's remains to Gezi Park and rebury them there. So I think that it's a very potent sort of symbol that certainly hasn't died down and is only sort of accruing strength at the moment. And I think it's continuing to. I don't know if it's more politicized. I think his Hasret was always overtly political. So it's just sort of a continuation, but what I'm interested in is looking at the different ways in which that Hasret is reinterpreted and how the new community or the community to come is redefined by different social or political movements.